Generalfeldmarschall Erich von Manstein stands in his command bunker near Kharkov, studying intelligence reports that defy every principle of military science he has learned in 4 decades of warfare. It's February 1943, and the Red Army should be exhausted, depleted, incapable of sustained offensive operations after the brutal winter fighting at Stalingrad. Instead, Soviet forces continue advancing westward with seemingly inexhaustible reserves, replacing losses faster than German forces can inflict them. The reports spread across Manstein's field table tell an impossible story. Soviet tank armies that German intelligence calculated as destroyed reappear within weeks at full strength. Soviet rifle divisions that suffered catastrophic casualties in previous battles return to combat with fresh equipment and trained personnel. Soviet artillery concentrations that expended their ammunition in massive barrages somehow maintain continuous fire support for advancing infantry. Oberst Reinhard Gehlen, chief of German military intelligence on the Eastern Front, enters the bunker carrying additional reports from Army Group reconnaissance units. His face shows the confusion and concern that have characterized German intelligence assessments since the Stalingrad counteroffensive began. The documents he carries reveal Soviet military capabilities that German planning never anticipated. Herr Generalfeldmarschall, Gehlen begins carefully, "Our latest assessments indicate Soviet reserve strength exceeds our previous calculations, significantly exceeds them. The formations we've destroyed are being replaced faster than we can eliminate them. Soviet industrial production appears to be operating at levels we considered impossible under wartime conditions." Manstein examines the intelligence summaries, studies the unit identification reports, checks the production estimates. The evidence is undeniable but strategically catastrophic. Soviet military strength appears to be increasing rather than decreasing under German pressure. The war of attrition that German strategy depends upon is being won by the Soviets. "How many reserve divisions do the Soviets have?" Manstein asks. Gehlen consults his notes, clearly uncomfortable with the answer he must provide. Current estimates suggest 400 to 500 reserve formations of various types, possibly more. Our previous assessment was 150 to 200 reserve units based on known Soviet mobilization capacity. The numbers are staggering. German forces on the Eastern Front, even with reinforcements from other theaters, total approximately 200 divisions. If Soviet estimates are accurate, the Red Army possesses reserve strength that exceeds total German strength on all fronts combined. The mathematical implications are strategically decisive. Generalfeldmarschall Günther von Kluge, commanding Army Group Center, has reached similar conclusions through his own intelligence analysis. Soviet offensive capabilities show no signs of the decline that German defensive strategy assumes. Instead, Soviet attacks become more sophisticated, better coordinated, more effective with each successive operation. "The Russians are learning," Kluge tells his staff officers. "Their tactics improve, their coordination improves, their effectiveness improves. They're not just throwing men at our positions anymore. They're developing genuine military competence while maintaining numerical superiority." Kluge's observation contradicts fundamental German assumptions about Soviet military capability. German doctrine assumes that Soviet forces depend on numerical superiority to compensate for tactical inferiority, that Soviet commanders lack the professional competence to conduct sophisticated operations, that Soviet military organization cannot sustain complex campaigns. But if Soviet forces are developing tactical sophistication while maintaining numerical superiority, German advantages in training and experience become insufficient to offset Soviet advantages in numbers and resources. German tactical superiority cannot compensate for Soviet strategic superiority when the Soviets achieve both numerical and qualitative advantages. Generalfeldmarschall Georg von Küchler, commanding Army Group North, provides additional evidence of Soviet military development. His forces face increasingly sophisticated Soviet operations that demonstrate improved planning, better coordination, more effective use of combined arms tactics. Soviet artillery coordination has improved dramatically, Küchler reports to OKH. Their infantry-tank cooperation is becoming more effective. Their air support is more timely and accurate. They're developing into a competent military force while retaining their numerical advantages. The development represents German's strategic nightmare, an enemy that combines numerical superiority with tactical competence. German military doctrine assumes that enemies must choose between quantity and quality, that numerical superiority requires tactical simplicity, that sophisticated operations require limited forces. Soviet forces appear to be achieving both numerical superiority and tactical sophistication simultaneously. The combination creates military capabilities that German forces cannot match with available resources and existing organizational structures. Generalfeldmarschall Fedor von Bock, recently recalled from command but still consulted on Eastern Front strategy, analyzes Soviet performance through the lens of his extensive combat experience. Bock commanded Army Group Center during the initial advance toward Moscow, understands Soviet defensive capabilities, recognizes the transformation in Soviet military performance. The Red Army we're fighting now is not the Red Army we fought in 1941, Bock tells senior Wehrmacht officials. They've learned from their defeats, adapted their methods, improved their capabilities. They're becoming a formidable military force while maintaining their resource advantages. Bock's assessment reflects growing German recognition that Soviet military development poses strategic challenges that German forces cannot overcome through tactical excellence alone. Soviet learning curve, combined with Soviet industrial capacity, creates enemy capabilities that exceed German capabilities to counter. The transformation occurs precisely when German forces are least capable of responding effectively. German reserves are committed, German industrial production is strained, German manpower is approaching its limits. Soviet improvement coincides with German decline, creating strategic imbalance that favors Soviet forces. General der Panzertruppe Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armored doctrine, observes Soviet tank operations with professional concern. Soviet armored formations demonstrate improved tactics, better maintenance, more effective employment. Soviet tank crews show training and competence that German intelligence never predicted. The Russians have learned to use their tanks properly, Guderian tells his colleagues. They're concentrating their armor, coordinating with infantry, employing combined arms tactics effectively. They're not just using tanks as mobile artillery anymore. They're conducting genuine armored operations. Guderian's observation represents a fundamental shift in German assessment of Soviet capabilities. Soviet armored forces, initially dismissed as poorly trained and inadequately equipped, have developed into competent formations capable of sophisticated operations. Soviet tank production, initially underestimated by German intelligence, provides numerical superiority that German forces cannot match. The combination of improved Soviet tactics and superior Soviet numbers creates armored capabilities that German forces cannot counter effectively. German tactical superiority in armored warfare, which provided decisive advantages in 1941 and 1942, becomes insufficient to offset Soviet numerical and industrial advantages. Generalfeldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel, chief of OKW, receives comprehensive assessments of Soviet military capabilities in March 1943. The assessments force fundamental reassessment of German strategic assumptions about the Eastern Front campaign. German planning must acknowledge Soviet capabilities that previous intelligence underestimated. Soviet military strength exceeds our intelligence estimates, the assessment concludes. Soviet industrial production provides equipment and ammunition that sustain continuous operations. Soviet manpower reserves appear adequate to replace losses indefinitely. Soviet tactical competence continues to improve through combat experience. Keitel understands the strategic implications immediately. German strategy on the Eastern Front depends on achieving decisive victory through superior tactics and training before Soviet numerical advantages become overwhelming. If Soviet numbers are already overwhelming and Soviet tactics are improving, German strategic objectives become unachievable. The war of attrition that Germany cannot win is being imposed by Soviet forces that possess both numerical superiority and improving tactical competence. German forces face enemy capabilities that exceed German capabilities to counter with available resources and existing strategies. Keitel requests a meeting with Hitler to discuss the implications of Soviet military development. The meeting occurs at the Wolf's Lair in April 1943, with senior Wehrmacht officials present. The discussion reveals the gap between German strategic assumptions and Eastern Front realities. Mein Führer, Keitel begins, Soviet military capabilities exceed our previous assessments. They're replacing losses faster than we can inflict them. They're improving their tactics while maintaining numerical superiority. They're becoming a formidable enemy while retaining their resource advantages. Hitler examines the intelligence reports, studies the casualty figures, considers the implications. German strategy assumes Soviet weakness, Soviet disorganization, Soviet inability to sustain prolonged conflict. If those assumptions are wrong, German strategic planning requires fundamental revision. How is this possible? Hitler asks. The Soviet Union is a backward country with inferior military organization. They lack the industrial capacity, the technical expertise, the organizational competence to match German capabilities. How can they be outproducing and outfighting the Wehrmacht? Keitel has prepared for this question, but the answer challenges fundamental Nazi assumptions about Soviet capabilities and German superiority. The Soviets have mobilized their entire society for war production. They've relocated their industry beyond German reach. They've simplified their military organization for maximum efficiency. The explanation suggests that Soviet organizational capabilities exceed German organizational capabilities in critical areas. Soviet total mobilization achieves industrial production that German partial mobilization cannot match. Soviet strategic planning provides resource allocation that German divided priorities cannot achieve. Hitler cannot accept that Soviet organization exceeds German organization. The admission would undermine fundamental Nazi beliefs about racial superiority, technological advancement, organizational efficiency. Instead, Hitler blames temporary setbacks, intelligence failures, inadequate German effort. But the evidence accumulates daily. German forces report constant encounters with fresh Soviet formations. German intelligence identifies expanding Soviet production facilities. German reconnaissance reveals Soviet military capabilities that continue to exceed German estimates. Generalfeldmarschall Walter Model, commanding the Ninth Army, provides tactical perspective on Soviet military development. Model's forces engage Soviet formations daily, understand Soviet capabilities through direct combat experience, observe Soviet tactical evolution through sustained contact. The Russians fight differently now, Model reports. They coordinate their attacks better, use their artillery more effectively, employ their reserves more intelligently. They're learning from their mistakes while maintaining their numerical advantages. Model's assessment confirms observations from other German commanders throughout the Eastern Front. Soviet forces demonstrate improved tactical competence while retaining numerical superiority. The combination creates enemy capabilities that German forces cannot overcome through tactical excellence alone. Soviet improvement occurs across all military categories simultaneously. Soviet infantry tactics become more sophisticated. Soviet artillery coordination becomes more effective. Soviet armored operations become more competent. Soviet air support becomes more timely and accurate. The comprehensive improvement suggests systematic Soviet military development rather than random tactical evolution. Soviet forces are learning through organized programs, structured training, deliberate analysis of combat experience. Soviet military education produces competent commanders, effective tactics, improved performance. General der Infanterie Kurt Zeitzler, Chief of the Army General Staff, analyzes Soviet military development through comprehensive intelligence assessment. Zeitzler's analysis reveals the scope and significance of Soviet military transformation since Stalingrad. Soviet forces have achieved qualitative improvement while maintaining quantitative superiority, Zeitzler concludes. They've developed tactical competence while retaining numerical advantages. They've improved their military effectiveness while expanding their military capacity. Zeitzler's assessment represents official German recognition that Soviet forces have become formidable enemies, capable of sophisticated operations. Soviet military development eliminates German advantages in training and experience, while preserving Soviet advantages in numbers and resources. The strategic implications are decisive. German forces cannot achieve victory through tactical superiority when Soviet forces achieve both numerical superiority and tactical competence. German strategic objectives become unachievable when Soviet capabilities exceed German capabilities to counter. Generalfeldmarschall Maximilian von Weichs, commanding Army Group South, observes Soviet offensive operations that demonstrate improved planning, better coordination, more effective execution. Soviet attacks achieve objectives that German defensive planning assumed were beyond Soviet capabilities. The Russians plan their operations more carefully now, Weichs reports. They coordinate their forces more effectively, execute their attacks more competently. They're conducting genuine military operations rather than simple frontal assaults. Weichs' observation reflects broader German recognition that Soviet forces have developed professional military competence. Soviet commanders understand operational planning. Soviet staff officers coordinate complex operations. Soviet forces execute sophisticated tactics. The development eliminates German assumptions about Soviet military inferiority. Soviet forces are no longer dependent on numerical superiority to compensate for tactical inadequacy. Soviet military competence, combined with Soviet numerical advantages, creates capabilities that German forces cannot match. General der Artillerie Walter Wenck, analyzing Soviet artillery employment, notes dramatic improvements in Soviet fire support coordination. Soviet artillery concentrations achieve effects that German defensive planning never anticipated. Soviet fire control demonstrates professional competence that German intelligence underestimated. Soviet artillery has become genuinely effective, Wenck observes. They coordinate their fires properly, concentrate their effects efficiently, support their infantry competently. They've learned to use their numerical advantages intelligently rather than wastefully. Wenck's assessment confirms Soviet development across all military specialties. Soviet forces improve their capabilities in every area while maintaining their numerical advantages. Soviet military education produces competent specialists, effective coordination, improved performance. The comprehensive improvement suggests that Soviet military development is systematic rather than accidental. Soviet forces learn through organized programs, structured analysis, deliberate improvement efforts. Soviet military organization facilitates learning that produces genuine competence. What German field marshals said when the Red Army kept advancing after Stalingrad was initially nothing. Said nothing officially because acknowledging Soviet military competence would require admitting German strategic failure, German intelligence inadequacy, German organizational limitations. But privately, in secure communications and personal records, German commanders recorded their observations. Manstein wrote, "Soviet military capabilities exceed our intelligence assessments. They're developing competence while maintaining numerical superiority." Klug noted, "Soviet forces improve their tactics while retaining their advantages in numbers and resources. They're becoming formidable enemies rather than inferior opponents." Guderian observed, "Soviet armored operations demonstrate tactical competence that our planning never anticipated. They've learned to use their numerical advantages effectively." Model concluded, "Soviet military development represents systematic improvement rather than random evolution. They're becoming professional soldiers while maintaining their resource advantages." The observations were accurate but strategically uncomfortable. Acknowledging Soviet military competence would require questioning German assumptions about racial superiority, technological advancement, organizational efficiency. The truth was politically unacceptable, ideologically impossible, strategically devastating. Instead, German leadership blamed temporary setbacks, intelligence failures, inadequate resources. Anything except the obvious explanation. Soviet military development exceeded German military development in critical areas, while Soviet resources exceeded German resources in decisive categories. The truth emerged gradually through post-war analysis, declassified documents, historical investigation. Soviet military transformation after Stalingrad represented organizational achievement that German forces never matched. Soviet systematic improvement provided advantages that German tactical superiority couldn't overcome. Soviet military development occurred across all categories simultaneously. Soviet tactical competence improved, Soviet operational planning improved, Soviet strategic coordination improved, Soviet industrial production improved. The comprehensive improvement created military capabilities that exceeded German capabilities to counter. What German field marshals said when they realized the Red Army had become a formidable military force was that Soviet organizational capabilities exceeded German organizational capabilities in critical areas. Soviet systematic development provided advantages that German traditional methods couldn't match. But acknowledging Soviet superiority was politically impossible, strategically uncomfortable, ideologically unacceptable. So German commanders said nothing officially while privately recording observations that confirmed Soviet military achievements. The silence spoke volumes about German inability to acknowledge enemy success, to learn from enemy innovations, to adapt German methods to match enemy capabilities. German tactical superiority couldn't compensate for Soviet organizational superiority, when organization determined military effectiveness. The Red Army kept advancing after Stalingrad because Soviet military development exceeded German military development in areas that proved strategically decisive. Soviet systematic improvement provided capabilities that German traditional methods couldn't counter effectively. What German field marshals ultimately said about Soviet military development, when they finally acknowledged the truth, was that Soviet organization exceeded German organization in the areas that mattered most. But they said it too late, too quietly, too privately to change the outcome of campaigns that Soviet military competence had already decided. Soviet military transformation after Stalingrad represented organizational innovation that German forces couldn't match quickly enough to matter. Soviet systematic development provided the foundation for Soviet victory, Soviet advance, Soviet ultimate triumph in the war that Soviet military competence had made inevitable.